Today is Saturday, October 29th, 2011. The place, 121 Main Street in Ames, Iowa. Genevieve and William Pyle first started this business. Today we're going to be talking with their son, Bill, who has come from Wisconsin to prepare the building for sale. So Bill, when did your parents come to Ames?
I believe it was in 1947. After the Second World War, my father returned to Ames to go to school to study civil engineering, and his hobby was photography. And so they lived in student housing at 718A, Pyle Court, and I vaguely remember being there because I guess moved there as a toddler, and I lived there until probably 1951. And so they would process people's film in Pyle Court, and even professors. And so he started a business called Pyle Photo Service, I know in 1948 because that's when he got his first tax permit. And so a hobby became a business. My father worked for Eschbach's Music House at Main Street and Kellogg. They had quite a photography department there, and with his experience, he worked there part-time, eventually full-time. And finally, he was spending so much time doing his own business, I think that Art Eschbach's and he came to an agreement that he should start his own work full-time instead of working part-time for Eschbach's Music House.
So 121 Main was the first?
No.
No, that was not the first location.
First 718A Pyle Court
yes.
there, and then they moved to 808 10th Street, and a photo business called Hamilton Photo here in Ames, that gentleman was going out of business. And so it was an opportunity there for my dad to take over some of his retail accounts. And so when he lived on 8th Street, he bought some higher capacity photo processing equipment that was mechanized as opposed to hand enlargers and tank developing. And so in the basement of 808 10th Street, he had his first actual, I think, production facility there. Mm-hmm. And as a second grader, I remember putting pictures on the dryer after school. In the afternoons when I went to Roosevelt School, we only lived about half a block away. I recall that. And from there, he moved to the basement of College Town Studio at 109 Welch Avenue. Not College Town Studio, excuse me, it was Campus. I think it was Campus Town Studio. And so he was in a basement there until 1956 or 57, actually until 59, because my mother and father purchased the building at 121 Main Street in 1959. And we were renting a house on Lincoln Way, and so this particular side of the building, both sides were for sale. They bought this one because there was an apartment upstairs and the family could live there. So in 1960, my family moved to Main Street and lived upstairs in the apartment, where my mother continued to live until she was 91 or 92.
What a long history at this location.
Yeah, so from 121 Main, it's been since 1960.
A lot of Ames history has passed under your fingertips, meeting a lot of weddings and birthdays and graduations.
That's true. My father he loved to be a photographer himself, so he didn't go into the studio end of it, he went to the production end of it. But I have found 4x5 negatives and people's weddings that he had taken pictures of in the early 50s and mid 50s. Mm-hmm. But then when he got into the photo processing, the photo finishing end of it, there wasn't time for that. Mm-hmm. And there was a niche to be filled. He would pick up the film around town, he even had some mail order accounts. It was all black and white in those days. We were black and white until 1975 when we put in color processing equipment when I joined the business. Mm-hmm. We expanded there. So the building has seen lots of transition. It was the first movie theater, I believe, in Ames. And it was a Shirey Paint and Hardware, so this part of the building was part of the hardware store. Mm-hmm. That Maud Shirey owned the building.
And of course, the digital age brought a lot of photo processing to an end. Kodak, for example, does not even make Kodachrome film.
That's true. And when we got into the color processing in the mid-70s, the industry had evolved from, say, a week to get your color film done to 24 hours. We had equipment that could turn around in 24 hours, and then it was that way, and we went to same day, and then in the 80s, the 1 hour came on the scene. So we've transitioned with our equipment from three or 4 days to the same day to a few hours down to an hour or less. And as you said, now the traditional silver halide photography industry is no longer in existence. Digital has taken over. In 2003, we purchased a combination digital film printer processor, which got us into the digital age. And you may take pictures of that back here. That's a dye industry also, because that's a wet process. Most everything now is a dry process. People have started doing everything at home, or if they don't want to mess with that, they'll take it to a big box store, send it over the internet, you order in, pick it up when you're ready to pick it up. So digital is really, we've seen the whole turnaround from large black and white negatives to small, compact digital media cards, and it's been quite a transition.
Well, let's take a look at some of that equipment that you've had here at Pyle Photography.
Glad to show you around. Most people started out for a hobby in photography of processing their own film. That was the first step to develop the negatives. And most people learned to use a little stainless steel or a plastic container, and you would thread the film onto a stainless steel or a plastic core. And this was all done in the dark. Of course, you'd put the top on, then you would put the chemicals in the top of the little container and close it up, and you would shake it for agitation and do it for the prescribed amount of time, whether it was 3 minutes or 5 minutes, depending upon your temperature of your developer, what kind you were using, and what kind of film it was. And then you would, if the timer would go off, you'd pour the chemicals out, put the next one in, and do that to get the process completed. And then you would just get the film out of the container and hang it up to dry, air dry. Then we moved to mechanized processes. Between the small handheld container and this machine, my father used crock tanks that were about this tall, and he would have racks. He could put 10 rolls of film in the crock tank at one time. So he had a series of crock tanks in this room, and it would be all done in the dark, and he would take the film off, break the cartridge open, and hang the film onto the little rack, and he would then move by hand the racks of film from one crock tank to another. But we did away with that in the mid-70s, and we put in, this was the first mechanized machine for this building as far as from the mid-70s on. We had some other machines for making prints and washing prints that were mechanized, but this was a black and white film processor. And we would put the film up here on a clip, and notice there's a tag right there, that's called a twin check. And we put
just a second, I'm going to look at that so we can show. Okay, there's that twin check.
Twin
Okay,
check.
gotcha.
That was a system we used to keep the person's film associated with their envelope, so film pictures were not messed up in the whole process.
Gotcha.
So we'd put the twin check on the person's name or by their envelope, so that number is the same as this number here. Because we didn't want the envelope to go through the machine. It would not get through there properly, it would get all wet. Anyway, so then we would, this is all done in the dark now after we have the twin check put on there. So in the dark we would take the cartridge of film down, and we would take pliers. There's other devices you could use, but we found pliers to be the handiest and the fastest. We would discard the metal container, and then we would hang the film on this loop. The machine's deep enough to handle 20 exposures of 35 millimeter or a 620 or a 120 or 127 size old film, but the 36 and the 24 exposures you had to loop it. So in the dark you would simply put the film around the loop, pull the plastic core away, and then you would take a weight and attach that to the bottom of the film.
Okay, I'm going to take a look at, see what you've done here. I'm zooming in so we can show that there's a weight. I see that weight. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay.
When the weight's attached, we would take a little horseshoe stainless steel weight. That would keep the film separated through the process so it didn't stick together. And after you have all the rolls of film hanging here, these racks happen to hold 7, you would take the rack and place it on a series of notches on each outside of the machine. And these teeth, they move down, they march the rack of film continuously through the machine at a set timing and from one chemical to the next. and then it would go through a light pass, and after it's been in the fixture, it could be introduced to white light. So outside the dark black curtain there is the outside room, and from there it goes into wash and then into a dryer where it's air dried, and that completed the black and white process. So, and then we have pumps that are circulating the chemistry and wash water. You have to have it a certain temperature. So all of that we try to control the process monitoring that way. So the density of the negatives is proper. Now the arms are coming down. It will engage this rack of film and take it up, and it'll move it over 2 or 3 inches, and it'll come back down and into the developer. And this process would take, probably an hour before it came out totally dry. It's not in the chemicals that long, but in the whole machine. So we bought this machine down in Des Moines used from a company that went out of business. The brand name was Pico, P-A-K-O. It's a very old, enduring graphic arts and photographic machine manufacturer in the Twin Cities. They've long since been out of business. There goes the film into the developer. And it would stay there 7 or 9 minutes depending upon the temperature. And you could vary the time a little bit by different apparatus on the teeth. And that's about all there is to that machine.
But this was all done in the dark.
In the dark.
Okay, Bill, now we're at the other end of the Pico machine. It's the film now is passed through all the developer and all that kind of thing. So what happens out here?
Yes, then when it comes out of the wash and the final wet tank, it drops into this long dryer cabinet. We have electric heater elements in the sides and overhead fans that circulate air, warm the air if you need to have warm air in the summertime. And then the machine will propel the rack of film through the dryer. When it gets out here at the end, it should be all dry, and then you can match it up with the envelope and take it to the print room.
Now, in the height of when this Pico machine was operating, like how many pieces of film would go through on your busiest day?
Oh, I think on our busiest day, probably 150 rolls, 200 rolls max. We were pretty small. Most of the time, at average, I'd guess 50 to 75 rolls a day.
That's still a lot of
But
film.
black and white, but it was somewhat varied because you had some color and some black and white. And as black and white became not quite as popular, we'd operate that, and maybe every other day we'd do black and white, as opposed to every day.
Right. And this piece of machinery is called?
This is an electrolytic silver recovery unit. The photographic industry used to be the predominant user of silver in paper and film, and of course you want to recapture as much silver as you can, and so this machine would use spent fixer, which has dissolved silver in the solution. We would put the solution in this side of the machine, and it would pump from this reservoir into another reservoir which had a cathode and an anode, and this machine would run electricity through the cathode and the anode, and as the fixer with the silver in it was circulated, the electricity through the solution would plate out the silver onto the stainless steel cathode here. And then you would recover the silver when it became thick enough to chip it off easily.
And when you recovered the silver, how could that get recycled into your process then?
Then we would strictly sell that to a silver refiner. And then they would sell it, I assume, to Kodak, and they'd use it back in the film or paper again. So we've always tried to be efficient and recover valuable things out of the solution and not pollute. It was always biodegradable from when Eastman Kodak first started color processing in the mid-70s. There were some chemicals they phased out. Formaldehyde was one, which was used for a while to stabilize color negatives, but they long ago did away with that.
Well, that was conservationists long before green was hip.
That's right.
And it was profitable enough to recover it that it paid for the machine?
Yes, it did. There is another way to recover silver. It's a cartridge and ion exchange system. That was kind of cumbersome, so this was more economical. And you got actual 99% silver pure on the cathode there. And so it started out years ago, it was $3 or $4 a troy ounce. And then the Hunt brothers, the silver prices went up, and the film prices and paper went skyrocketing. And then the silver market again plunged. It went down to $7 a troy ounce, and now recently up to $40 a troy ounce. So I just recovered some silver about a year and a half ago, and I think, I forget how many pounds I had, maybe 4 pounds. I believe I got $1,200 out of it. So it was very profitable, and it kept the silver sludge and stuff out of the sanitary sewers for sure.
This is going to be a photographic enlarger. Tell me a little bit about this.
Yes, this was the second enlarger my father purchased. It would make up to 11 by 14 size enlargements, or larger from 4 by 5 negatives. And I believe my dad got this in the 50s. It's an Omega enlarger. And of course, hand enlargers don't produce prints very fast, but when he had an order of a lot of 8 by 10s or things to make, before we had mechanized printers to do that, he would crank out the enlargements on this enlarger here.
Okay, I'm going to start at the very top, and maybe you can just tell me what some of the parts and pieces are of this.
Okay. Oh, at the top?
Yes.
At the top we have the housing that holds the lamp, the projection lamp.
Okay.
And some enlargers have fans on there to keep them cool, but I think this one did too. So the enlarger lamp, then you would have a carrier that you would put in here to hold the negative flat, and you'd shine light through the negative. It would go through a lens and project down to the piece of paper on an easel. And depending upon the size of the enlargement you wanted to use, you would change the enlarger up or down to magnify the print down at the bottom.
Gotcha.
And you would use a timer to precisely measure the amount of exposure time you wanted the print to have. And this is where craftsmanship came in. Someone who's using a hand enlarger can dodge and burn, and they can make test prints and experiment with smaller pieces of paper to get the exact output they want to have done in the print, and then they can make the full enlargement. So it's time consuming, but quite a bit of craftsmanship that went into this. Certainly more custom photography was done here.
So was this continually used when you were in the process, or was it pretty much mechanized by the time
By
you
the time I got in, we pretty much
Yes.
phased out production of mini enlargements. We made contact sheets, whereas we put a strip of negatives down in a device, put a sheet of paper underneath that, and just project light through all the negatives on the roll and make contact sheets. So that was about the extent of what I did with this particular machine.
Do you still have some prints that your father did with this machine?
We do have some. Yeah, I'm not sure I can really put my hands on it, but I've saved them in the boxes of pictures the family has.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you didn't use a hand processor, you'd be using something mechanized then.
Right. Instead of taking each individual print and putting them into a tray of developer, stop, bath, fixer, and wash, then we became more mechanized. We would print one picture after another on a long roll of paper. So we might have 10 or 15 rolls of pictures from different customers on one roll of paper, which we would print in a roll printer. We'd come in. Now, in this room, if it was colored, it'd be totally dark. If it was black and white, you could have a safe light. After we got the roll of paper out of the printer, we'd come into the room, take it out, and put it on this machine. And we would attach a little clip that would, it's going to pull the paper from the start attached to this blue leader belt all the way through the machine and then into a dryer cabinet, which you can see the gray back there at the end of this machine is a dryer. So you would simply attach the paper, turn the machine on, and it would pull the paper off of the little core. It would go up and down through all the tanks and progress through the machine, attached to this leader belt, which was continuous through the machine, into the dryer, and the paper would come out, and you would take the paper off of the blue belt and put it on a take-up roller after the dryer, and you would have processed pictures. And from there you would cut the individual pictures apart with another device, a cutter, which we don't have anymore. Or you could use a paper cutter, slower way.
So, Bill, what's going to happen to all these old pieces of equipment?
They'll be just scrap for salvage metal value. There's really nothing else that is of any value. The the tanks are not, in this machine, stainless steel, but in some of the older machines, they were stainless steel, and they're more valuable on the scrap market. Right now, the price of metal is up a little bit, so you can get a bit more out of your scrap iron and steel, and that's where these machines will go.
Is anybody doing film anymore?
Yeah, it's hard to find someone who will process color film, and especially black and white film, because they years ago came out with a film that was compatible with the color process that gave you a black and white negative of sorts, and it made pictures like a black and white. Well, the digital age, you can just transfer back and forth from color to black and white. You don't need to have black and white film. And it's tough to find someone who will process color film now. And I suspect in the next 5 years you won't be able to find anybody commercially doing that. All the big box stores are putting in their processes. They don't even have a film processing machine anymore.
People might have to go back to that little stainless steel thing that you run
In
around the
their
school.
home dark rooms. And then where can you buy the paper or the chemicals? That's the next thing. You have to go back like they did 100 years ago and formulate your own chemicals. I suppose you could do that for the purist and the person in the hobby.
That right here.
Okay, this is a Kodak color printer, but it can be used for black and white prints as well as color. But it's nothing more than a glorified enlarger. Sophisticated in itself because it has density controls, it has sensors that would sense the amount of light going through the negative. If it was a color negative, it would analyze that. The operator had to look at the negative and make a judgment call as to how much time from a normal negative that the operator needed to add to the picture to make it come out properly after it was printed and processed through the long roll paper processor. The machine started out with vacuum tubes. I'm not sure exactly when Kodak came out with these particular printers, but the overall design of the chassis and the mechanism stayed the same for probably 25 years. You could buy a machine that would print 5-inch paper, 8-inch paper, and 11-inch paper, depending upon the size of print you had to make in your lab. This was the last color printer that we used long roll that would print pictures in a long roll. From the time we quit using this machine, we went to machines that were combined printers and paper processors, and the pictures would go through, and there was a cutter right there on the machine. So we put the film down here at the light source. On this particular machine, the light source is at the bottom, down here. Light would shine up through the negative, through a lens, which was mounted on a little mechanism here that you could move up and down, depending upon the size of the print you wanted to make. We could vary the width of the paper easel inside to make different size pictures, and then the other knob would determine the amount of paper that was fed after each exposure was made. And so each print was made individually, but then paper would be accumulated inside the machine over on this side. This is supply side paper. Exposure takes place right here, and then the machine would move forward, say 6 inches or 5 inches, and all the pictures would accumulate over on the right hand side. And then you would simply, in the dark, open the door, which we have open now, but you would open it in the dark, or in a safe life you had black and white paper, cut off the paper, and you would take this roll of printed pictures into the paper processing room and run it through the paper processor. So it's nothing but a very sophisticated enlarger.
And how long did you use this, did you say?
We had this model, I used this for probably 15 years, predominantly from the 80s into the mid-90s. I happened to buy this one new. I had purchased some other ones used.
It's still pretty labor intensive though.
This one was, yeah. You have to look at every particular negative. It's not really very mechanized as far as production is concerned. There were some printers that I don't have that were much more sophisticated. The large labs would have spliced film together in long rolls. The machine would automatically feed it through. They would analyze the negative and make the exposure, but they were still just enlargers.
Let's look at your graph here. You have a graph on this. And what is this telling us?
Oh, this was my key to know what particular lens I needed to have with a particular negative size, and then you had to have a particular lens, and you had to have the lens at the right height. You had to have the paper easel open the correct length, and you had to also have the paper feed the correct amount. So this was my brains here for different sizes that I made on this particular machine, which was pretty much from 35 millimeter up through 120 size film. I guess you could do 4x5s on it. However, I never did that very often. An interesting thing was I bought this machine. The disc film was coming out, and of course the disc and the 110 are pretty much dead formats. The disc especially is dead, but this machine had a device where I could print the pictures from the small round disc negative with an attachment that I had in place here. So it was a very versatile machine.
I'm not sure people can appreciate how much hands-on human involvement there was on their film processing prior to, say, 1990 maybe?
Probably. That's probably right. A lot of everything looks simpler than it is. You see the final product, and that was easy to do. But there was a lot went into it. A lot of design and a lot of technology. These machines, as I said, progressed from vacuum tubes to solid-state relays and transistors and diodes, and even into the digital age as far as handling data is concerned. Which this machine is strictly a transistor, and it's not digitized itself.
Does it work?
It works except for it does work, except there's a buzzer that goes off when the paper is supposed to transport. I think there's a cog in the back. There's a little device that goes up and down when the paper has traveled the proper distance. I tried to get it to cycle itself, but it didn't. I can make an exposure. There's an exposure, and it's supposed to transport the paper.
I see.
And I'll try one more time here. Now it's supposed to transport paper, but I say there's something not working in the back.
Does this machine have a future?
No value. These machines were phased out pretty much by the late 1990s.
And this model is?
This is a Kodak color printer 5S-4, and I think that it probably was new. I bought it used. It was probably new in the 1970s. And then they transitioned from the 5S4 to the changed the electronics, and they became 5S5s, or I think they skipped the 5 and went to 5S6, which was the next to the last. This is a 5S Model 6. The 5 designates 5-inch wide paper. I can't tell you what the S stands for. Just they call them S printers. This machine I purchased new in 1994. The beauty of this machine is that it is a combined paper processor and dryer and a printer. And this machine had a video monitor on it, so when you saw the negative in the negative gate, instead of looking at a negative, you would see the positive image on the screen, so you could make color corrections and density corrections, and you would be able to see your corrections, and you could manipulate the picture until it became an optimum picture. Then you would print the picture. You wouldn't have to make it again for some reason because you blew it the first time, like we used to have to do on reading the negative density or the color required. So that was nice, and the paper, instead of using the rolled paper and having to go in the dark room to load that S printer, you could just put the paper in a dark room, but bring the canister out, put it on the machine, and you could change between 4-inch, 5-inch, 8-inch size pictures or paper to make different size pictures. The process was speeded up. These are all pumps, circulation pumps and heaters. In the color process, of course, everything has to be minutely controlled to keep it in sync to get the right results. So this machine we used for probably 12 years. It sped up productivity because there wasn't any waste. It was compact, took up a lot less room, and it was a fun machine to use. The pictures would go up and down through the processor and come out the dryer It would go through and roll in lengths about 12 feet long, but there was an online cutter here that sliced the print. So they would come out into a hopper. Each roll would be in one particular compartment.
So each time a new piece of equipment came along, you were kind of like a new photographic engineer.
Yeah, you had to be able to fix things yourself to a certain extent until we got into more sophisticated machines. This did have a hard drive, 2 hard drives on it. The program was set up, and so if a bad card or something went bad with it, you couldn't fix it yourself. You had to send a circuit board in to be replaced. So about the time that this machine came in the mid-90s, you had to almost quit doing some of the easy fixes. You could do very easy fixes, but then you had to call on a serviceman, which became expensive and time-consuming. They might not be able to get there for a day or two.
And when people expected their pictures in a short time,
hour.
Yeah.
Sorry. But most, so I'm going to try to work around it.
Bill, you got this. You said in the 1990s.
This
Fuji. Yeah.
It's a color film processor, and you see how small and compact it is. And
Yes.
this processed. The theory behind this is it's a leader card transport machine. You'd splice the roll of film, the end of it, to this leader card, and you would have 2 rolls of film attached to one leader card. These little sprocket holes here in the card will engage in drive gear in each one of the racks in the machine. It will propel the leader card, which has the film attached to it, through the chemicals and out through the dryer. So this little bitty machine replaced a huge amount of metal that we used for probably 20 years, 19 or 20 years. And there again, the time in the process, it was much shorter, and the film always came out more consistent. The controls were much more precise.
But there wasn't as much human interaction with this.
No. The main job was just go ahead and splice the film onto the card, put the card into the machine, close the top, and as soon as the lid went shut, the machine would start to transport that leader card with the 2 rolls of film attached through the processing chemicals. And then when the film reached the end of where it's attached to the plastic core, the machine would sense that, and it has automatic scissors. It would come down and cut the film off. So of course the metal cartridge can't go through the machine, but the film continued on, and then it would come out the other end all dry. I can go get a card there and show you what it looks like.
Well, I'm sort of just amazed at how much smaller things are.
Right. Yeah.
Just
compactness. So here are 2 leader cards with processed color negatives attached. The footprint of all the machines, because you understand that the price of square footage, if you had to rent it, or these big box stores, that the price of where they operated machines was very expensive, I'm sure. So the more compact, the better in most people's eyes.
Bill, this was a technical business, but you were also, in a sense, dealing with people and their memories and their photography. And I just can't help but thinking there must have been some funny things that could have happened in this business.
Yes, funny things seem to happen every day. It's good things and bad things. Some of the funniest things, I think, are when people would bring a roll of film in, you'd process it, you'd give them back the pictures, and they'd say, "These aren't my pictures." Well, you would panic because it might have been our mistake, and that did happen occasionally, but sometimes you knew that it was someone else had borrowed their camera or taken pictures with their camera. They didn't know about it, and yeah, it was actually their film that they brought in, and so they'd always argue about that, and you just had to bite the bullet and say, "Okay, I'm sorry," give them a new roll of film and move on. But then there's always near tragedies. A man brought in film from Australia. He had gone with a color slide film to the middle of the outback there to take a picture of Ayers Rock, and he was such a good customer. And he stayed with us for years and years. But my machine, my slide processor, I had a mechanical breakdown with the film in the process, and I couldn't get it out. I couldn't save it. So his roll of film from Ayers Rock in Australia was ruined, and we felt terrible, and I'm sure he felt terrible. And all he has is the memories and maybe some other people's pictures. So that wasn't very funny, but the funny thing is he stayed with you as I'm sorry, things happen. But other other instances where people come in, and my mother was she was the front person who could deal with people. She loved people. Her personality was such they loved her, and she'd been in the business for all of her working career. And she loved to have people just come in and say hello, whether they brought a roll of film in or not. They didn't. Sometimes just came in to say hello to my mom, Genevieve, how are you doing? And so we had kind of a social gathering down here at this end of Main Street for years and years. I had great employees, and we always had jokes, we always had fun. We had, some guys were jokesters, and we always had birthday celebrations, and it was a lot of fun. This was the last printer processor we purchased in 2003. I actually had a 5-year lease on the machine, but we bought the machine at the end of the lease. And this is the machine that got us into the digital age, because it was a machine that would process both film, it would print film, as well as digital media. And so a person might bring in a camera card, someone who was actually the forefront of the digital age in 2003 when cameras were first coming out that were, say, 3, 4, 5 megapixel. But we would put the camera cards here into the computer, the image would come up on the screen, and we would make corrections and print the pictures. And this part here is the printer. There are cartridges that contain paper, and you would simply open the door down below, slide in the particular paper you wanted, and there was very little waste with this machine either, because of course you can see the corrections we made, and the machine didn't have to use any leader paper to thread the machine or anything. So each picture was made individually and propelled itself through the machine by a system of racks in these different processing tanks. The picture there again would go through the dryer and come out completed. But this machine had the advantage of having a sophisticated scanner so that the negatives were individually analyzed and could be run automatically. You could thread the roll of film in here, it would read and scan the entire roll of film, it would determine what kind of corrections to make, and it would do it all by itself if you wanted to do that. We didn't do that. We monitored the machine to make sure, because occasionally the machine would not make a print to the optimum value that we wanted. So we would always watch the machine and pretty much did do the corrections, each one individually. But it had a higher capacity. We could run 200 rolls through this machine in a day easily, or even half a day. And it had the advantage of being able to make a picture up to 12 inches wide, so we could make up to 12 by 18 size enlargements. So this one machine did away with 3 other printers. It was a great machine to work. It was made by AGFA Corporation, which is now also the photographic arm of AGFA is no longer in existence. And I found out that AGFA was actually in the photographic industry longer than Eastman Kodak was. But this company quit making the machines, and it's got a little bit of intrinsic value now. Some people are still using it, since it is still a wet process machine, but the paper is getting harder to find and more expensive. So I'm lucky to just be able to find someone who can utilize this high-tech machine right now, and it will be moved out of the building shortly.
Well, I think, Bill, a fitting place to end our conversation is with this camera that has been in the window of Pyle Photography since 1976. I certainly remember it passing by so many times. Tell me a little bit about it.
I believe my father acquired this particular camera and stand from Hart Studio, which was in business here in Ames for many years. I can't tell you exactly when they started. I think in the 40s, 50s, 60s even, they were taking pictures at a portrait studio. I think my father must have purchased this camera when they went out of business, and I can't there again tell you when. But that's my understanding, is he got it from Hart Studio. The camera top and body is a Smith's camera, portrait camera number 12. And this gentleman Smith, I've done some research and know that he was making cameras in the 1880s in Chicago. And he did that for about 20 years, and he then got into making other things in the photography industry. I think he owned half his portrait studio too, so he probably used his designed cameras in the portrait studios. But if I remember correctly, Mr. Smith got into making consistent flash charges for people who were using the old handheld Smile, and they would ignite the flash, the powder, and it would make the flash so they would have enough illumination to capture the picture on the photographic plates. I think his company became the manufacture of those consistent compact charges so people would know what kind of illumination they would get. The stand is Century camera by Eastman Kodak. Century camera was I think also made in Rochester, but I think the Eastman Kodak purchased that company, but the nameplate on the base still says Century, made by Eastman Kodak Company, and I think it was being made around the turn of the century, 1900. I'm not sure when they acquired Century. The lens happens to be 8x10 portrait lens from a drug and photo supply in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's I think it's Junkind photo supply. So I believe the lens, and it looks like a more modern lens, it has looks like a cord for an electronic flash probably to operate the with the shutter. So it's a combination of at least 3 manufacturers, but it dates back to the late 1800s.
Well, thank you for sharing the history of this particular camera as well as the history through technology at Pyle Photo at 121 Main Street.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure and my family's pleasure to having lived in Ames and served our customers. Thank you very much.